Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to dive deep into a piece of pop culture history that, well, let's just say it stirred up a lot of conversation back in '92.
That's right, Madonna's sex book. Even decades later, it keeps people talking. And that's what we're going to explore, why it made such waves and what its legacy really is.
I got to admit, going through all these materials, it's clear this wasn't just your average celebrity photo book. It was an event. Even the way it was put together, metal binding, soft paper, the works, and the photos themselves. Definitely not your grandma's coffee table material.
Absolutely. Sex really pushed those boundaries of what was considered acceptable, especially back in '92. We're talking soft-core pornography, which was a huge deal for mainstream media at the time.
And it wasn't just anonymous models, right? She pulled in some big names for this.
Oh, for sure. Madonna herself, often, well, not wearing much, but also celebrities like Isabella Rossellini, Naomi Campbell, even Vanilla Ice, who was, I think, her boyfriend back then, made an appearance.
Vanilla Ice. Wow, that's a throwback. Interesting choice, considering his image at the time. Shows how Madonna was willing to shake things up, even at raised eyebrows. But it wasn't just photos, right? There were poems, stories.
You got it. Alongside all that photography, she included poems and stories written under the pseudonym Mistress Dita, so it was a literary layer on top of all the visuals.
So imagine, it's 1992, no internet as we know it, far less imagery, bombarding us constantly. Then, bam! Sex hits the shelves. Must felt like a cultural earthquake.
It was a major event. Just in the US, 150,000 copies sold on day one. Then globally, within days, over 1.5 million. Everyone was trying to get their hands on it.
And the reactions, well, they were about as divided as you can get. Some people hailing it as groundbreaking art, a bold statement of female sexuality. Others completely condemning it as vulgar, pornographic, even sparked boycotts from groups like the Vatican.
You're exactly right. It was huge controversy. And it wasn't limited to just one place or culture. From the Vatican to India, people were debating whether sex was art, whether it should be censored, and of course, all those questions about sexuality.
That kind of backlash, it's got to be overwhelming. Makes you wonder, what was Madonna really aiming for with sex? Was this a calculated move, publicity stunt, or something deeper?
That's a question that keeps fascinating people, even now. The publisher Judith Regan was definitely involved, but there are different versions of how it all really began. Was it Madonna's vision or Reagan's? Still some debate there.
But Madonna, she definitely had an artistic vision. Where did she draw inspiration for this project? I know she was influenced by punk rock, those photographers like Guy Borden and Helmut Newton, even channeled that 1930s actress Dita Parlo as her alter ego, Mistress Dita.
You've hit on some key inspirations there. It's really interesting how they show up in the book. You see those echoes of Bourdain and Newton's provocative style in the photography, and that punk rock rebellion that comes through loud and clear in the whole message of challenging norms, embracing individuality.
So it wasn't just
Yeah.
about shock value. There was some real artistic intention behind it.
Yeah.
This kind of fusion of rebelliousness with classic Hollywood glamour, all through Madonna's lens.
Exactly. And we got to factor in the timing, too. Sex came out alongside her erotica album and that film, Body of Evidence. Madonna even called it her season of sexual scandal. So it was all very deliberate, a kind of a trilogy exploring sexuality and desire.
A season of sexual scandal. That's a loaded phrase, very deliberate. It really suggests that she wasn't just out to shock. There was something more calculated going on, maybe even subversive, you know?
Definitely. And if you connect this to Madonna's whole career, it's obvious she's always been about pushing boundaries, starting conversations. Doesn't matter if it's through her music, videos, or now with this book.
Absolutely. Never one to shy away from controversy. But with sex, was she saying something more than just, look at me? There's this theory that the book was partly her response to the AIDS crisis, like a way to imagine this utopia of sexual freedom when there was so much fear and loss going on.
That's a really insightful point, especially when you think about how some of the songs on erotica are actually dedicated to friends she lost to AIDS.
It adds another layer to the sex book, doesn't it? It becomes more than just provocation. There's this sense of mourning, this longing for a world where sexuality can be celebrated openly without fear.
Exactly. To really grasp sex, we need to see it within that larger context. The AIDS crisis and Madonna's ongoing exploration of sexuality and what society considers acceptable.
So yeah, on the surface, it might have seemed shocking, but the sex was actually deeply tied to what was happening culturally at the time and Madonna's own experiences. And this wasn't just a standalone project. It was part of this bigger artistic statement woven into her music and film work.
That's a great observation. The book, the album, the film, they all fed into each other, creating this multifaceted exploration of sexuality that challenged the status quo and pushed those boundaries further than ever before.
Which is, well, pretty much what Madonna's done throughout her career. It's really interesting to see how sex fits into that whole trajectory of pushing boundaries and challenging norms. We'll have to dive deeper into that when we come back. We've been talking about how sex was this, like, perfect storm of controversy, right? The content itself, Madonna's fame, the media just going crazy. But to really get how big the reaction was, it has to compare it to other controversial stuff from back then.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, other books, artworks, they might have caused debate, but sex went mainstream in a way very few things did. It was everywhere. Your neighbor, the news, everyone was talking about it.
I remember reading about the Vatican calling for a boycott. Even India thought it was offensive. This wasn't just some small argument. It was a global thing.
Oh, absolutely. It went beyond borders and cultures, forced the whole world to talk about art, censorship, and obviously how we understand female sexuality, which was changing a lot then.
It's wild how one book could do all that. But amidst all the backlash, did sex actually lead to any positive changes?
That's a tough one. It's complicated, but I do think sex played a part in making female sexuality more accepted. Even if that wasn't always the plan, it forced people to confront their own biases, about women, about sex, about what art can be.
So the controversy itself, in a way, was part of the message. It got people talking in a way they might not have otherwise.
Exactly. It pushed society to have those uncomfortable conversations, to really look at those old ideas about women and sex, and to admit that women have the power to express themselves however they want.
And we can't forget how it influenced other artists. It gave them permission, especially women, to be bolder, to express their sexuality without shame.
Oh, yeah. You see it in artists like Miley Cyrus, Christina Aguilera, so many who followed Madonna's lead. They took what sex did and pushed it even further in their own ways.
It's funny how what's shocking one day becomes normal later on. Makes you think, would a project like sex even have the same impact today? In our world of social media where we see everything constantly.
That's the big question, isn't it? Has that shock factor just disappeared? Or would it still cause the same controversy, the same conversations? It's hard to know for sure.
It's a different world, that's for sure. Social media has changed how we react to things, and our ideas about sexuality have kept evolving.
But one thing's for certain, sex is this fascinating example of how art can be provocative, can challenge us, and ultimately can change culture, even when people fight against it.
Totally. It
Yeah.
reminds us that art isn't separate from the world. It's part of it, it sparks debates, and it can even change how we think and act. It can push things forward, even when it makes us uncomfortable.
Exactly. And sex shows how important artists like Madonna are. Those who take risks, push boundaries, they often get criticized, but they also get us talking, open our minds in ways safer art might not.
As we wrap up our deep dive into sex, what are the key takeaways here? What's the lasting importance of this book?
Well, first off, it shows how powerful art can be. It can make us question things, challenge what we think is normal. It reminds us that art shouldn't be silenced, even when it makes us squirm or rethink our ideas.
Sex really brought those conversations about sexuality out into the open, right? It helped us start talking more honestly.
Exactly. And it's a powerful example of how one artist with a bold vision and that willingness to take risks can change culture and society.
Madonna's sex might have been controversial, yeah, but it was groundbreaking too. It left its mark on pop culture, and we still feel that influence today, both in other artists' work and in how we think about sexuality.
I think it's fair to say that even if the images themselves seem, well, maybe not as shocking today, the fact that she did it, the timing, Madonna being unapologetically herself, that makes it a huge moment in history. It's about artistic vision, societal backlash, and ultimately how art can change the world.
It's a really fascinating and complex legacy.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up completely, there's one more layer we got to explore. We've talked about the shock value, the impact, but what about the book as art? How did critics actually receive it? So we've been talking about all the uproar sex caused, but I'm curious, once the dust settled, what did critics actually think of the book itself, like beyond the shock value?
That's where it gets kind of interesting because, yeah, the book was huge culturally, but a lot of critics, even some who admired how bold Madonna was, they thought the content, well, wasn't all that great.
Really? You'd think with all the controversy, it'd be super wild, even by today's standards.
You'd think so, right? But some reviews from back then, they used words like childish, juvenile even, like it was more about shock than actual artistic depth.
So was it all hype? Was sex more about getting attention than having something real to say?
It's tough to say for sure. I think the content, while it was pushing boundaries then, might not have aged as well as some of her other stuff. What was taboo in 92 might seem pretty tame now, with how cultures changed, how easy it is to find explicit stuff online.
Right, right. Things that shocked us once, they kind of lose their power over time.
Exactly. But even if the pictures themselves aren't as shocking now, the fact that she did it, the timing in 1992, that's what still stands out. It's like a snapshot of this moment when how we talk about female sexuality was really starting to change.
So maybe the images themselves wouldn't cause as much of a stir now, but the context, the backlash, the conversations it started, that's what makes sex historically important.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that art's never separate from the world around it. It reflects its time and it can shape culture in big ways, even if that wasn't the artist's plan, or if it takes a while to see the effects.
Sex definitely did that. It pushed what was considered acceptable, challenged those deep-rooted societal norms, and in the end, it helped us talk more openly and honestly about female sexuality.
Absolutely. And it's that legacy, that fearlessness, that willingness to make people think and question things, even if it's uncomfortable, that's what makes sure sex will keep being studied, debated, and reinterpreted for years to come.
It's wild how one book, even one that might seem kind of dated now, can have that kind of impact.
It shows the power of art, right? To capture a moment, challenge us, and leave a mark on culture that lasts.
Well said. So wrapping up our deep dive into Madonna's sex book, it's obvious we've been talking about way more than just some provocative images. This was a cultural phenomenon reflecting this pivotal moment in history when the conversation about women and sexuality, art, and freedom of expression was really shifting.
And it gives us a lot to think about. Would something like this still be shocking today? Has the internet, with all its information overload, made us less sensitive to this kind of stuff? Or would it still be controversial, push boundaries in new ways we haven't even thought of?
Those are questions that go way beyond Madonna, beyond this one book. They get at the core of what art is, what censorship is, and how the rules change over time.
We encourage you all, our listeners, to think about these questions, maybe revisit some of the sources we talked about, and keep exploring this fascinating intersection of art, culture, and sexuality.
And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Talk about it, debate with your friends, keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and as always, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.